Hey guys, tonight we're going to dive into the absolute miserable chaos of the Battle of Waterloo. Now, you might think of this as a grand, heroic event. The final, epic showdown that ended a century of war. But in reality, it was a cold, muddy, and utterly miserable affair. We're going to put you right there, in the thick of it, so you can feel the rain on your face, the mud sucking at your boots, and the low, constant rumble of an artillery barrage that was so loud you could feel it in your bones. This wasn't a battle of glory, it was a battle of endurance, of luck, and of pure, unadulterated human suffering. You almost certainly would not have survived it. The odds were stacked against everyone, from the lowliest private to the most decorated general. It was a meat grinder, and most of the meat went into the ground. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're listening from somewhere far away, or maybe just down the street. Tell us your location and what time it is for you right now. It's always wild to me how we're all listening to this at the same time. From all over the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're a French soldier, a young man from the countryside who has been swept up in the whirlwind of the Emperor's return. It's June 1815, and the world thought Napoleon Bonaparte was gone for good. A political ghost exiled on the tiny island of Elba. But then came the news. A rumor that spread like wildfire across Europe. A rumor that was so unbelievable it had to be true the Emperor had escaped. You remember the day you heard it. The electric thrill that shot through you. Napoleon was back, and you, a young man who had only heard the stories of his great victories, were now part of the final act of his incredible story. You've joined the Grande Armée, not out of any deep political conviction, but out of a sense of adventure, a desire to be part of something bigger than yourself. The march through Belgium was a desperate, rushed affair. The Emperor was trying to catch his enemies, the English under the Duke of Wellington, and the Prussians under Marshal Blucher, before they could link up. You marched for days, the sun beating down on you, your heavy wool uniform sticking to your skin. The air was thick with dust and the sweat of thousands of men. You were tired, hungry, and a little scared. But you were also a part of a legend. You were part of Napoleon's last great gamble, and the sheer audacity of it all was intoxicating. You remember the cheers from the local people, the women handing you water, the old men tipping their hats. It felt like you were part of a triumphant procession, not a desperate race against time. The first few skirmishes were a blur. The Battle of Ligny, where Napoleon defeated the Prussians, was a chaotic, bloody mess. But you were told it was a great victory, and for a day or two. You believed it. The Prussians were in full retreat, and Wellington was isolated. It seemed like the Emperor was going to pull it off, that he would once again conquer Europe. The morale of the French army was sky high. You believed, with every fiber of your being, that you were on the cusp of another great victory. Another Austerlitz. Another Jena. You had the greatest general in the world leading you, and you felt invincible. But then, the weather turned. It started with a light drizzle, and then it became a steady, relentless downpour. The roads, which had been dusty and hard, turned into a thick, sucking mud. Your boots, which were already worn and ill-fitting, became heavy with the weight of the clay. The cannons, which were the pride of the French army, sank into the mud, and the horses struggled to pull them. The whole army, which had been moving so quickly, was now bogged down, you remember thinking. This is not how a glorious victory is supposed to feel. This is a key historical fact. The unseasonably wet weather in the days leading up to the battle severely hampered the movement of the French army and delayed their attack on Wellington. And then, you arrived at the battlefield. It's a place you will never forget. You're standing on a muddy slope, looking out at a rolling landscape of green fields and low hills. In the distance, you can see the redcoats of the English and their allies, arranged in long, neat lines. You can see the glimmer of their bayonets, the flash of their officers' swords. The air is cold and damp, and the ground is so soft that you can barely keep your footing. You're told this is the place. This is the final, epic battlefield. But it doesn't feel epic. It feels like a swamp. It feels like the wrong place to fight a battle. This brings us to a point that historians still debate: to what extent did Napoleon's poor health and judgment, combined with the bad weather, lead to his defeat at Waterloo? Some argue that the emperor was simply not the same man he was at Austerlitz, that he was suffering from a stomach ailment that left him weak and indecisive. Others argue that the weather alone was enough to scuttle his plans. The debate is complex, but for you, a soldier standing in the mud, it doesn't matter. All you know is that the great emperor, who you believed was a god of war, seems a little less sure of himself, a little less confident. He is waiting, and you are waiting, and the rain is falling. A little known but fascinating detail of this time is the sheer noise of the camps. You might think it would be quiet, but it was a constant, low-level hum of thousands of men trying to get by. You could hear the constant rumble of the cannons as they were moved into position, the shouting of the officers, the whinnying of the horses, and the low, constant chatter of men who were trying to keep their spirits up. It was a sensory overload, a constant reminder that you were a part of something huge, something terrifying. And in that noise, you can hear a kind of quiet desperation, the sound of men who knew, deep down, that this was the end of a long, glorious story, and that they might not be around to see the final page. As you stand there in the mud, you can hear the English fifes and drums in the distance, a jaunty, mocking sound that seems to be saying, "We're here, we're ready, and we're not going anywhere." You're cold, you're wet, and you're tired, and you know, with a grim certainty, that this is going to be a long, terrible day. The battle hasn't even started, but the misery has already begun. And as you try to get some sleep, curled up in a muddy field, you can't help but wonder what tomorrow will bring, and if you will even be around to see it. The sun is trying to break through the gray clouds, but all it really does is make the mud steam. You're still there, on the French side, waiting. You've had a miserable night. The ground was too wet to sleep on, and you're soaked to the bone. Your musket is heavy, and you're worried about the powder getting too damp to fire. The air smells of wet earth, wet wool, and the nervous sweat of tens of thousands of men. This isn't the field of glory you imagined. It's a swamp, a quagmire that seems to be actively working against you. The rain from the night before, a relentless downpour that soaked the entire region, had turned the battlefield into a bog. Every step you take sinks a few inches into the thick, clay-like mud. This is a crucial and often overlooked detail of the Battle of Waterloo: the weather. The rain was not just an inconvenience. It was a character in this grim drama. It delayed Napoleon's attack by several hours, giving Wellington more time to arrange his defenses and, most importantly, giving the Prussians more time to march toward the battlefield. The rain also made it nearly impossible for the French cavalry to charge with their usual speed and force, and it made the artillery barrage far less effective. As you look out at the field, you can see Wellington's army, the British redcoats and their allies, dug in on the opposite ridge, but you can't see all of them. The Duke of Wellington, a man of quiet genius, had a brilliant tactical plan. He hid most of his troops behind the crest of the ridge, a little-known tactic called the reverse slope defense. This meant that Napoleon's artillery, which was the pride of his army, would have to fire blindly over the ridge, and most of the shots would just fly harmlessly over the heads of the waiting soldiers. the English infantry, meanwhile, were protected from the worst of the cannonballs, and they would only stand up and present a target when the French infantry was close enough to be fired upon with devastating effect. It was a simple, elegant plan that perfectly suited the muddy conditions of the battlefield. Wellington himself, a man known for his calm, stoic demeanor, was in his element. He was an officer who understood the terrain in a way that few others did. He had chosen this specific battlefield for its strategic advantages: the long ridge, the gentle slope, and the small farmhouses and chateaus that he could fortify and use as strongholds. You remember hearing the name Hougoumont, a large farmhouse on your right flank that was fortified with thick stone walls and bristling with English and German soldiers. You know that to get to Wellington's main line, you're going to have to get past that, and the prospect of that seems daunting. To say the least, the contrast between the two commanders is stark. Napoleon, the great offensive general, the master of the swift, decisive attack, is bogged down by the mud and forced to wait. Wellington, the great defensive general, the master of the patient, bloody repulse, is sitting in his saddle, confident that his position is unassailable. This is a point that historians still debate: to what extent was Waterloo a victory for Wellington's tactical genius versus a defeat for Napoleon's hubris and bad luck. Was the weather a decisive factor, or was Napoleon so overconfident that he would have lost anyway? It's a debate that highlights the complex interplay of human choice, environmental factors, and the sheer randomness of war. A little known but fascinating detail of this time is the sheer amount of food and drink that was consumed by the soldiers in the days leading up to the battle. Despite the terrible conditions, there was a constant effort to feed the men. You remember a ration of hard biscuits and a small amount of wine, a paltry meal that was meant to give you the strength to fight. But the real luxury was a small piece of cheese, a rare and precious thing that was savored slowly. For a brief moment, you could forget the mud and the rain and the fear, and you could just be a man enjoying a meal. It's a small, human detail that makes the grand, sweeping narrative of the battle feel a little more real. The miserable conditions of the battlefield are not just a problem for you, they're a problem for everyone. The cavalry horses, which are the pride of the French army, are slipping and sliding in the mud. The infantry, who are supposed to march in neat, orderly columns, are struggling to keep their footing. The entire army, which was once a symbol of speed and power, has been slowed to a crawl, and in the distance, you can hear the faint sound of cannon fire, a low, ominous rumble that seems to be getting closer. It's the sound of the Prussians, the army that Napoleon thought he had defeated, marching back to the battlefield to join the fight, and, with a grim certainty that this is going to be a long, terrible day, a day of mud and misery, and that the beautiful, glorious victory you imagined is now a distant, faded dream. The rain is a memory, but the mud is a constant reality. You're standing in your company, a small part of a massive army that stretches for miles. The air is filled with the shouts of officers, the nervous chatter of men, and the rhythmic, grinding sound of cannons being maneuvered into position. The sky is still gray, but now there's a different kind of darkness approaching the sound of war itself. A low, constant rumble that seems to shake the very ground beneath your feet. It's the French Grand Battery opening fire, but the artillery barrage, which was supposed to be the decisive opening of the battle, isn't working as planned. Remember how Wellington hid his troops behind the crest of the ridge? Well, that simple, genius move is making your army's greatest strength virtually useless. The cannonballs are flying over the heads of the English infantry, landing harmlessly in the fields behind them. The French artillerymen, the proud veterans of 100 battles, are growing increasingly frustrated. They're adjusting their aim, firing at the tops of the ridge. But it's a game of blind luck. This is a common historical fact. A significant portion of Napoleon's initial artillery fire was ineffective, allowing Wellington's troops to remain largely protected and conserve their strength for the coming infantry and cavalry assaults. You're not an artilleryman, you're an infantryman, a private in a line company. You're standing there, in your heavy wool uniform, with your musket in your hand, and you're waiting. You're listening to the dull thud of the cannonballs, the shrieking whistle as they fly overhead, and the constant, unnerving sound of the shells exploding in the air. The sound is so loud that you can't even think. It's a physical assault, a constant, low-level thrum that vibrates through your chest and makes your teeth rattle. You feel more like a target in a shooting gallery than a soldier in a great army. The noise, the smoke, the sheer chaos of it all is disorienting. And then, as the noise dies down a bit, you see them, the English. They're standing in their long red lines, looking impossibly neat and tidy, like toy soldiers on a massive muddy tabletop. They're just standing there, waiting for you. It's a terrifying sight. You can see the gleam of their bayonets and the glint of their officers' swords. They're not running, they're not hiding. They're just there. A solid red wall of defiance. You've been told that the English are cowards, that they will break and run at the first charge. But looking at them now, you don't believe it. This brings us to a point that historians still debate. Was Napoleon's confidence in the effectiveness of his initial artillery barrage a form of hubris? Or was it a calculated risk that was simply thwarted by Wellington's superior tactics? Napoleon had always relied on his artillery to soften up the enemy before his infantry and cavalry went in for the kill. At Waterloo, that plan was failing, and the emperor seemed unable or unwilling to change his tactics. This highlights a crucial theme of the battle. The old ways of fighting were running into a new, more modern form of defense. And in the end, the old ways lost. A little-known detail from this time is how the soldiers would try to cope with the sheer noise and stress of the battlefield. You would see men humming to themselves, or softly singing a song. Some would be praying, their lips moving silently in a desperate plea for salvation. Others would be telling jokes, trying to lighten the mood with a bit of dark humor. These small human acts of defiance were the only thing that kept them from completely losing their minds. For a brief moment, you could forget the terror and just be a man, not a soldier, and you could find a small measure of peace in the middle of a war. But the peace doesn't last. The shouting of the officers starts up again, and you're pushed forward. The charge has begun. You're a part of a massive column, a huge, dense formation of men that is supposed to smash through the English lines. You're running, but the mud is sucking at your boots, and you're struggling to keep up. The English start to fire. You can hear the whistle of the musket balls as they fly past your head, and you can see the men around you falling. The red wall is not breaking. It's standing firm, and it's firing with a cold, terrifying precision. You're just a number, a body in a massive column, and you're marching, or rather stumbling, toward a wall of death. And as you fall to the ground, your body is just another piece of meat in a great, muddy, bloody field. And in that moment, you realize that the glorious victory you imagined is nothing but a lie. A cruel, mocking fantasy that is now buried in the mud of Waterloo. The air is thick with the smell of gunpowder and the shouts of men. You're a French infantryman, stumbling forward in a massive column, and the wall of redcoats in front of you seems unbreakable. The muskets are firing with a terrible, methodical precision, and you can see your comrades falling all around you. The glorious charge you imagined is a desperate, muddy crawl toward a wall of death. But as you look around, you realize something is wrong. The great man himself, the Emperor Napoleon, seems absent. He's not the same man you heard about in the stories. He's not the lightning fast, decisive general who won a dozen battles against impossible odds. He seems slow, indecisive, and strangely detached. The Battle of Waterloo was a testament to Napoleon's genius, but also a tragic showcase of his frailty. in the days leading up to the battle and on the day itself. The emperor was not at his best. He was suffering from a debilitating stomach ailment, possibly a severe case of hemorrhoids or a urinary tract infection. That left him in immense pain and unable to ride his horse for long periods. You can almost picture him, sitting on a chair with his maps. A man who built his empire on the back of his horse, now grounded by his own physical weakness. This is a common historical fact. Napoleon's health was a major factor in his poor performance at Waterloo, leaving him lethargic and slow to react to the changing situation on the battlefield. You see him, a small, distant figure on a white horse, and he doesn't seem to have the same fire in his eyes. He's making strange, uncharacteristic decisions. He delayed the start of the battle for hours, waiting for the ground to dry, a delay that gave Wellington more time to fortify his position, and, most importantly, gave the Prussians more time to march to the battlefield. A younger, healthier Napoleon would have attacked at dawn, a surprise attack that would have caught Wellington completely off guard. But this Napoleon, this older, sicker Napoleon, was waiting. He was waiting, and you were waiting, and the rain was falling, and the Prussians were getting closer. This brings us to a point that historians still debate: to what extent did Napoleon's physical health, rather than his strategic decisions, cost him the battle? Was he simply out of his prime? A man whose time had passed, or was the physical pain and discomfort so severe that it clouded his judgment, turning a potential victory into a total defeat? The debate is complex, but for you, a soldier on the battlefield, the effect is the same. The great man, the god of war, seems to be faltering. A little known but fascinating detail of this time is how Napoleon's generals reacted to his strange behavior. Marshal Ney, a brilliant and hot-headed cavalry commander, was frustrated beyond belief. He kept asking for orders, for direction, for a plan. But the emperor seemed unable to give them. Ney, in a fit of desperate impatience, would eventually launch a massive, uncoordinated cavalry charge against Wellington's lines. A charge that was doomed to fail. You remember seeing the cavalry, the pride of the French army, galloping across the muddy field, a magnificent, terrifying sight. But you also remember the sound of the muskets, and the sight of the horses and the men falling, and, with a grim certainty, that it was all for nothing. The charge was a spectacular failure, a pointless sacrifice of men and horses that only weakened the French army further. A slightly humorous, if dark, detail from this time is how a soldier's perception of his commander would change. The emperor, who was once a distant, godlike figure, was now just a man, a sick, tired man who was making mistakes. You can see the doubt in the eyes of your comrades, a quiet, unspoken fear that their great leader was no longer so great. The faith that had carried you through so many battles was starting to crumble, and in its place was a cold, terrifying reality. So, as you continue your miserable march toward the English lines, you can't just blame the weather or the enemy. You have to also acknowledge the man on the white horse, the man who, for all his genius, was still just a man who was sick and old and tired, and as you fall to the ground, your body just another piece of meat in a great, muddy field. You can't help but wonder if the story of the Emperor's last gamble was always destined to end this way. Not with a glorious victory, but with a miserable, tragic whimper. The ground is a bog, the air is thick with smoke, and the English lines are a stubborn, unmoving wall. But now, you see a new kind of spectacle unfolding before you. The ground starts to rumble, not from the cannons, but from the thundering hooves of thousands of horses. It's the French cavalry, the cuirassiers and the lancers. A magnificent, terrifying sight. Their polished breastplates and gleaming helmets flash in the dim light, and their lances, held high, look like a forest of steel. They are charging a wave of humanity and animal fury, and you, An infantryman can only watch in a state of terrified awe, but you also know, with a grim certainty, that this is not a good idea. The ground is too soft. The cavalry, which relies on speed and momentum, is going to be bogged down by the mud, and the English, who have been waiting patiently, are ready for them. You see the red lines of infantry, which were so intimidating to you, now forming into perfect, unmoving squares, bristling with bayonets. It's a classic defensive formation, and it's specifically designed to repel a cavalry charge. The horses, which are smart animals, will not willingly impale themselves on a wall of steel. The cavalry, for all their bravery and all their spectacle, are charging toward a suicidal wall of death. This is a common historical fact. The French cavalry charges at Waterloo were a spectacular failure. A series of ill-coordinated and desperate attacks that cost the French army thousands of men and horses. Marshal Ney, in a fit of hot-headed desperation, launched attack after attack, a total of 11 massive charges, all of which were repelled with devastating losses. The English infantry, standing firm in their squares, simply waited until the last possible moment, and then fired with a terrible, methodical precision. The horses would veer away, the men would get bogged down in the mud, and the charge would simply fizzle out, leaving the battlefield littered with the bodies of men and animals. A little-known but fascinating detail from this time is how the soldiers in the squares would taunt the French cavalry. They would laugh and jeer and make rude gestures, a kind of psychological warfare that was meant to break the French morale. They would shout, "Come on, boys, let's see what you're made of." And the cavalry, already frustrated and tired, would only get more and more angry. It was a vicious cycle of taunts and frustration, and it was a battle that the English, who were on the defensive, were winning. The cavalry, for all their fury, were getting nowhere, and the infantry, for all their passivity, were slowly but surely winning the day. The sheer futility of the charges is a point that historians still debate. To what extent was Marshal Ney's impetuosity to blame for the failure of the cavalry charges? Or was it Napoleon's fault for not providing him with clear orders and a coherent plan? Ney was a brilliant cavalry commander, but he was also a man who was easily frustrated and prone to making rash decisions. Napoleon, meanwhile, was strangely absent and seemed unable or unwilling to rein in his hot-headed general. The debate highlights the complex interplay of a commander's personality, a general's orders, and the sheer chaos of the battlefield. A slightly humorous, if dark, detail from this time is how the English infantry would pass the time between charges. They would sit down in their squares, clean their muskets, and even eat a small piece of bread. They were so confident in their formation and their ability to repel the French that they saw the cavalry charges as little more than a minor annoyance. They were like a seasoned veteran boxer, standing in the middle of the ring, waiting patiently for a younger, more aggressive opponent to punch himself out. And as you watch the last of the cavalry charges fade away, you can feel a sense of dread settling in your stomach. The pride of the French army, the glorious, magnificent cavalry, has been defeated. They've been beaten, not by superior tactics or superior numbers, but by mud and patience and a few well-placed squares of redcoats. The battle is far from over, but the momentum, the sense of invincibility, has been lost. The dream of a glorious victory is now a distant, faded memory, and in its place is a cold, hard, miserable reality. The French cavalry is a broken thing, its strength and spirit spent against the unyielding red walls of the English squares. The battlefield is littered with the bodies of men and horses, and a quiet, desperate hum of moans and cries fills the air. But as you, an infantryman, catch your breath in the muddy field, a new, more sinister threat is emerging on the horizon. It's a low, dark cloud of men, a phantom army that was supposed to have been defeated, It's the Prussians, and their arrival is about to turn a miserable day into a total catastrophe. Remember Marshal Blucher, the old Prussian general who was supposed to have been chased away by Napoleon? Well, he wasn't after the Battle of Ligny, where he was badly beaten. He retreated, but he did not run. He was a tough, grizzled veteran, a man who hated Napoleon with a passion, and he was determined to rejoin the fight. He had promised Wellington he would come, and he was a man of his word. But the march was a nightmare. The roads were a muddy mess. The men were exhausted and demoralized, and his own body was in terrible pain after a fall from his horse at Ligny. He was an old man, and the journey was a test of his body and his will. This is a common historical fact. Blucher's desperate march to the battlefield was a crucial turning point, a testament to the old general's sheer tenacity and a deciding factor in the outcome of the battle. You can almost feel the dread spreading through the French ranks as the news of the Prussians' arrival starts to filter down. It's a whisper at first, a rumor that is too terrifying to believe. But then you can see them, a faint line of blue-coated soldiers on the horizon, their bayonets catching the dim light. They're not marching in neat, orderly columns. They're a ragged, exhausted mob. But they are here, and they are filled with a cold, righteous fury. They remember the humiliation of the past, the defeat at Jena, and they are here for revenge. They are not here to fight a battle, they are here to kill. The arrival of the Prussians completely changed the dynamic of the battle. For hours, it had been a tense, brutal duel between Napoleon and Wellington. Now, it was a three-way fight, and the French were outnumbered and outflanked. Napoleon had to send a significant portion of his reserves to hold off the Prussians, men who he desperately needed to break the English lines. The battle, which was already on a knife's edge, was now a complete disaster for the French. The Prussians, for their part, were not subtle. They were not fighting a tactical battle, they were fighting a war of attrition, a bloody, brutal slog through the mud and the chaos. This is a point that historians still debate. To what extent did Wellington's reliance on Blucher's arrival betray a lack of confidence in his own army? Was he just waiting for a miracle? Or was it a calculated risk that he knew he could take? The debate is complex, but for you, a soldier on the battlefield, the effect is the same. The arrival of the Prussians means that the battle is lost. The hope, the faint, desperate hope you had been clinging to, is now gone. A little known but fascinating detail of this time is how the Prussian soldiers would chant Blucher's name as they marched. They were a beaten, demoralized army, but the promise of revenge, the promise of finally defeating their great enemy, gave them the strength to keep going. The sound of their voices, a low, guttural chant in the distance, was a terrifying sound. It was the sound of a ghost army coming back to life. And it was a sound that you will never forget, a slightly humorous, if dark, detail from this time is how the French would try to taunt the Prussians. They would shout insults and curses, but the Prussians would just keep marching. A grim, silent wave of revenge. It was like trying to stop a tsunami with a handful of stones. The sheer, unstoppable force of their hatred was a terrifying thing to behold. So, as the darkness of the evening starts to settle over the battlefield, you can hear the sounds of the Prussian advance getting louder and louder. The battle is now a total rout. The French army, which was once a glorious, invincible force, is now a broken, demoralized mob. The emperor who promised you glory is now a distant, defeated figure, and as you try to run, to escape the chaos, you can feel the cold, righteous fury of the Prussians behind you, a force of nature that is about to sweep you away and erase you from history. The French cavalry is a broken thing. The Prussians are a vengeful tide, and the battlefield is a swamp of mud and blood. The air is so thick with smoke from the cannons and the muskets that you can barely see 10 feet in front of you. the constant noise, a low, grinding roar that has been your only companion for hours, is starting to fade in and out, a sign of your exhaustion and the sheer sensory overload. But even as the noise starts to become a dull hum, you can still feel the ground shaking. It's the sound of the Grand Battery, Napoleon's artillery, a force that was supposed to be the key to victory, but has become a symbol of the day's futility. The French artillerymen, the proud veterans of countless campaigns, are a study in grim determination. They've been firing all day, a relentless, deafening barrage that has sent thousands of cannonballs shrieking across the muddy field. But Wellington's brilliant reverse slope defense, where he hid his troops behind the crest of the ridge, has rendered their efforts largely useless. The cannonballs, which were supposed to tear massive holes in the English lines, are instead flying harmlessly over their heads or sinking into the soft, muddy ground. It's a frustrating, heartbreaking spectacle, a massive display of power that is achieving almost nothing. You're a young recruit, and you've never seen anything like it. The sheer scale of the noise is unimaginable. You can't hear the men next to you. You can't hear the shouts of your officers, and you can't hear the screams of the wounded. All you can hear is the constant, low-level thrum of the cannons, a sound that feels less like a battle and more like a force of nature. It's a physical assault on your senses, a constant, unrelenting pressure that is slowly but surely driving you to the edge of madness. This is a common historical fact. The noise of the artillery barrage at Waterloo was so loud that it could be heard for miles around, and it was a source of immense psychological trauma for the soldiers who had to endure it. A little-known but fascinating detail from this time is how the soldiers would try to deal with the noise. Some would stuff bits of cloth or paper in their ears, a small, futile attempt to block out the sound. Others would just sing to themselves, a quiet, desperate hum that was their only defense against the madness. It was a kind of internal retreat, a way of finding a small, quiet space in the middle of a screaming, chaotic hell. It's a small detail, but it speaks volumes about the human need to find order in the face of chaos. The futility of the artillery barrage is a point that historians still debate. To what extent did Napoleon's stubborn reliance on a strategy that was clearly not working contribute to his defeat? Napoleon had always been a master of artillery, a man who believed in the power of a concentrated cannonade to win a battle. But at Waterloo, his faith in his guns was misplaced, and he seemed unable or unwilling to change his tactics. He kept firing, long after it was clear that it was a waste of ammunition and a waste of time. The debate highlights the tragic flaw of a man who was once a genius, but who, on this day, was a prisoner of his own past glories, a slightly humorous, if dark. Detail from this time is how the soldiers would try to spot where the cannonballs were landing. They would watch for a puff of smoke or a spray of mud in the distance. A small, grim game that was their only way of trying to make sense of the chaos. It was a kind of deadly golf, a game where the only prize was a moment of knowing, a moment of understanding in a world that was becoming more and more insane. And as the sun starts to set, and the firing starts to slow down, you can feel a kind of quiet settling in. It's not a peaceful quiet, it's a terrifying, hollow quiet. The quiet after the storm. The Grand Battery has been silenced, not by the enemy, but by its own futility. The battle is far from over, but the great, thunderous heart of the French army has stopped beating. And in that quiet, you can hear the screams of the wounded, and you can hear the footsteps of the Prussians. And you know, with a grim certainty, that the end is coming, not with a roar, but with a whimper. The day is slowly, painfully, coming to an end. The Grand Battery is silent, the cavalry is spent, and the Prussians are a vengeful, incoming tide. The battlefield is no longer a place of organized warfare. It's a hellscape of mud, blood, and broken men. But there is one last act to be played out. One final, desperate roll of the dice from the Emperor. He is sending in his last. Most precious reserve, the Imperial Guard? You're an infantryman, a tired, terrified survivor of the day's fighting. And you can only watch in a state of numb despair as the greatest soldiers in the world march to their doom. The Imperial Guard was the elite of the French army, a force of veterans who had fought in 100 battles. They were the Emperor's personal guard, his last resort, and the very symbol of his power and invincibility. They were tall, disciplined, and utterly devoted to Napoleon. They wore immaculate uniforms and marched with a kind of grim, terrifying dignity when they were on the field. The morale of the entire French army would soar. They were a legend, a myth. And now, that myth was about to be put to the ultimate test. You can see them. A magnificent, dark column of men, marching in perfect formation toward the English lines. They're not running. They're not charging with wild abandon. They are marching a slow, methodical, and utterly terrifying advance. The English, who have been fighting all day, are looking on in a state of nervous awe. They know who these men are. They know what they are capable of. And for a moment, the battle hangs in a state of suspended animation, a quiet, tense moment before the final, brutal climax. This is a common historical fact. The final charge of the Imperial Guard was a moment of immense drama and tension. A last-ditch effort by Napoleon to break the English lines and win the day. But the Guard is not marching toward a disorganized, broken army. They are marching toward a force that has been holding a strong defensive position all day. An army that has been waiting patiently for this exact moment. Wellington, with his usual calm, gives the order, "Up, guards," and at them, the English infantry, which has been lying down on the ground, rises as a single, terrifying wall of red. The surprise is total. The Imperial Guard, who were expecting to see a broken, demoralized enemy, are instead met with a volley of musket fire from a line of soldiers who are fresh and ready to fight. The effect is devastating. A little known but fascinating detail from this time is how the soldiers on both sides would try to talk to each other. The Imperial Guard, who were used to winning, would shout, "Surrender, you English dogs!" The English, with a cold, dry wit, would shout back, "We don't surrender, you French pigs!" It was a kind of deadly, absurd banter, a moment of dark humor in the middle of a screaming, chaotic hell. It's a small detail, but it speaks volumes about the human need to find a connection, even a hostile one, in the face of death. The failure of the Imperial Guard's charge is a point that historians still debate. To what extent was the Guard's charge a strategic blunder on Napoleon's part? Or was it a desperate, last-ditch attempt that was simply doomed from the start? Napoleon had a few options, but he chose to send in his most precious reserve. A move that, had it worked, would have won him the day, but it didn't, and in its failure, it broke the back of the French army. The debate highlights the thin line between a genius move and a catastrophic mistake. A slightly humorous, if dark, detail from this time is how the English soldiers would later describe the Imperial Guard. They said that they were too proud to run, and that they died where they stood. A testament to their incredible bravery and discipline. It was a kind of grudging respect, a recognition that they were not just fighting men, but a legend, and that they had finally gloriously broken that legend. And as you watch the last of the Imperial Guard's charge crumble, you can feel a sense of finality settling in. The great army, the glorious, invincible force that had conquered Europe, is now a broken, defeated mob. The Emperor is gone, and the battle is lost. And as you try to run, to escape the chaos, you can hear the faint, mocking cry of the English, a sound that will haunt you for the rest of your life. The Guard is in retreat. The sun is setting, casting long, dark shadows over the battlefield. The Imperial Guard has been broken, and with them, the last vestige of French hope is gone. The army once a disciplined, fearsome force, has now dissolved into a panicked, screaming mob. The rout has begun. You're no longer a soldier, you're a refugee. A desperate man running for his life in a sea of his own countrymen. The battle is over, but the misery, the terror, and the sheer brutality of the aftermath have just begun. The French army, which was once so proud and so organized, is now a chaotic mess. Men are throwing away their muskets, their packs, their everything, in a desperate attempt to run faster. The roads, which were already a muddy mess, are now completely clogged with a frantic, terrified humanity. The sound of shouting, of weeping, of cursing, and of the constant low-level thud of hooves is everywhere. It's a complete and total breakdown of order, a terrifying, primal scramble for survival. This is a common historical fact. The rout that followed the Battle of Waterloo was one of the most chaotic in military history. A total collapse of an army that was, for so long, a symbol of discipline and order. But you're not just running from your own fear. You're running from the enemy. And the enemy is not being subtle. The Prussians, who arrived late to the battle, are now on the field. And they are not in the mood for mercy. They remember the defeat at Ligny, the humiliation of the past, and they are here for revenge. They are chasing the French, a grim, terrifying pursuit that is as much a massacre as a military operation. They are not taking prisoners. They are simply killing anyone they can catch. Their old general, Blücher, a man who hated Napoleon with a passion, had given them a simple order: no mercy for the French. And they are following it with a cold, terrifying glee. A little-known but fascinating detail from this time is how the Prussians would play their bugles as they chased the French. They would play a jaunty, mocking tune, a kind of musical taunt that was meant to demoralize the fleeing soldiers even more. It was a cruel but effective form of psychological warfare, a way of saying, "We've won, and now we're going to make you pay for it." The sound of the bugles, a light, mocking tune in the middle of a screaming, chaotic hell, was a sound you will never forget. The brutality of the pursuit is a point that historians still debate. To what extent was the Prussians' revenge a justified act of war? Or was it a barbaric and unnecessary massacre? The Prussians had been humiliated by the French for years, and they felt that they were simply evening the score. But the sheer scale of the killing, the cold, methodical nature of the pursuit, was a shocking and terrifying thing to behold. The debate highlights the thin line between war and murder, and the terrible things that can happen when a defeated army is at the mercy of a vengeful enemy. A slightly humorous, if dark, detail from this time is how a soldier's perception of his own uniform would change. The beautiful, pristine uniform you started the day with is now a mud-caked, torn rag. The symbols of your pride and your loyalty, the eagle on your helmet, the cross on your chest, are now just a target, a sign that you are a Frenchman, and that you are an enemy. You've become a man without a country, without an army, and without a future. And as the night starts to fall, and the sound of the pursuit starts to fade, you find yourself alone. A small, insignificant figure in a vast, cold, indifferent landscape. The battle is over, but the war, for you, is just beginning. You're a ghost, a survivor of a massacre, and you will spend the rest of your life trying to run from the memories of a miserable, muddy, bloody day. And as you try to get some sleep, curled up in a ditch, you can hear the ghosts of the battle all around you, the faint, weeping sounds of the wounded, and you know, with a grim certainty, that you will never truly be free of them. The darkness has fallen, and the chaos of the rout has faded into a quiet, cold night. The battlefield is no longer a place of screaming and fighting. It's a silent, vast graveyard. The air, which was once thick with the smell of gunpowder and blood, now smells of rain, wet earth, and the faint, sweet stench of death. You've survived, somehow, but you are a ghost, a survivor in a world that has been irrevocably changed. The Battle of Waterloo is over, but its echoes, its lessons, and its unimaginable cost in human lives will live on for centuries. The first and most obvious echo is the sheer human cost. The numbers are staggering. In a single day, tens of thousands of men were killed or wounded. The field was a sea of bodies, a grim testament to the brutality of war. But the real cost wasn't just in the numbers, it was in the individual lives. In the fathers and sons and brothers who never came home. It was in the broken families, the widows, and the orphans who were left to fend for themselves. The Battle of Waterloo wasn't just a military victory or defeat, it was a human tragedy on a scale that is almost impossible to comprehend. Another echo is the end of an era. The Battle of Waterloo was the final act of a long, brutal drama that had lasted for over 2 decades. It was the end of the Napoleonic Wars, the end of Napoleon's empire, and the beginning of a new, uneasy peace in Europe. It was a turning point in history, a moment when the world shifted from one age to another. But for the men who fought and died on that muddy field, it wasn't an end, it was just a day of unimaginable suffering. A day that they would never forget, and a day that they would never truly leave behind. This brings us to a point that historians still debate to what extent was the Battle of Waterloo the decisive battle that ended Napoleon's reign. Or was it simply the final nail in the coffin of an empire that was already crumbling? Napoleon had already been defeated once, and his empire was already teetering on the brink. Waterloo was a dramatic and symbolic end, but was it a truly decisive one? The debate challenges us to think about the nature of history itself, and whether it is made by single, great events, or by the slow, grinding forces of time. A fascinating and little-known detail from this time is how the battlefield was cleaned up in the days and weeks after the battle. The local farmers and villagers, with a grim and heavy heart, would come and bury the dead, and they would scavenge the battlefield for anything of value: a musket, a helmet, a piece of clothing. It was a grim, but necessary, part of the process. A way of trying to find some small measure of order and value in the midst of a terrible, chaotic tragedy. A dark and slightly humorous detail from this time is how the bodies of the dead were used. The bones of the soldiers, the teeth, and even the hair were often scavenged and sold. The teeth of the dead were often used to make dentures, a grim but popular practice at the time. The hair was used for wigs and other accessories. It was a kind of macabre recycling, a way of turning a tragedy into a grotesque commodity. It's a chilling reminder of how little a human life was worth in a time of war and desperation. So, as we come to the end of this journey, I want you to take a moment to reflect. The Battle of Waterloo was not a glorious victory or a heroic defeat. It was a miserable, muddy, and bloody day that was defined by exhaustion, luck, and unimaginable suffering. It was a battle that was fought not by great men on white horses, but by young men in muddy boots. And it was a battle that, in the end, changed everything. The sun will rise on a new day. But for the men who fought on that field, the battle will never truly end. It will live on in their nightmares, in their scars, and in the quiet, unspoken language of a people who have survived the unspeakable. The world has returned to a fragile kind of normalcy, but in the hearts and minds of the people, the misery of Waterloo will never truly end. It will live on, a ghost in the collective memory, a reminder of a time when the world was a cold, cruel, and very, very dark place. And in that, there's a kind of strange comfort, a sense of shared humanity that connects us to them. Across the centuries, in the quiet, still of the night,